Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Airmail's Night at the Newsstand. We're delighted to be joined by Saad Mohseni, who's the co-founder and CEO of the Moby Group. He also serves on the advisory board of the International Crisis Group, and he's also the author of a wonderful new book, Radio Free Afghanistan, which is about his 20-year mission to establish a free press in his home country despite the Taliban's rule. We're lucky to be joined by another media legend and another brave man, Tom Freston. Tom is the former CEO and COO of Viacom. He was one of the founding team at MTV in 1980 and was chairman and CEO of MTV Networks for 17 years. He's also a senior advisor at RAIN, a merchant bank, and longtime board chair for the One Campaign, an advocacy organization that focuses on extreme poverty in Africa. Please give Tom and Saad a round of applause.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here at the Airmail flagship store. And I see a lot of familiar faces. And we're celebrating my good friend Saad's first book. I think it hits tomorrow?
Yes, tomorrow.
The 24th. So we have a big stack of them around. It's a great book. It's a gripping tale. It's true. And it's two of my favorite subjects, which are one, the power of media to influence social customs and mores, and two, Afghanistan, a place where I've spent a fair amount of time. You know, everybody loves a rags to riches business startup story where somebody kind of steps into something unexpected and it turns out to be something, you know, wilder than they ever dreamed of and has an influence. It sort of transcends and has an influence far above anything that the founder might have thought of. And this is sort of the story of this book, which, you know, is Saad's 20-year run. It's a wonderful, wonderful tale, and it has a interesting ending, as we all know from the papers, what has happened to Afghanistan. But Saad was brave enough and ingenious enough to build really from nothing a media conglomerate that sort of dominated Afghanistan's media space. And in the process, he was able to do several things that never happened before. He was able to get Afghans, he connected Afghans to each other, he connected Afghans to the rest of the world, which had never happened before. It was a landlocked country, it had no media before this. And he was able to push a social agenda that included things like gender equality, keeping girls in school, just tolerance. He brought back music, he brought back the arts. He built a state-of-the-art news organization that was the premier news organization in the country. And then, as we know, the Taliban, the country collapsed basically, and the Taliban returned. I couldn't notice that yesterday our brave Saad said in the Sunday Times of London, after the Taliban put out, and you just think it's sort of like one of our political campaigns here where you think it can't get any worse, it can't get any lower. Well, having erased women pretty much totally from the public space, they came out with a statement, a law saying that women could no longer talk in public. To which Saad and his company is still on the air, Talo TV, he called the Taliban buffoons, which I'm sure they enjoy, and said that he was actually hiring more women to be on the air as presenters, twice as many as were there during the 20-year interval before the Taliban sort of reinserted themselves. So, for one question, how do you think that's going to go down in Kabul?
Thank you, Tom. Well, I'm not sure. You know, this is, I can't say anything with a great deal of confidence because we're not sure. Everything's in flux and they continue to change the rules. I'm going to be very frank with you tonight, so I'm going to give you the sort of R-rated version of what's really going on. But then if there's anyone from the media, I can later on give you a G version of what's going on. But what we did was, first and foremost, thank you, Tom. You've been a great friend for many, many years, and you know, it's as always, you're very well prepared, even for a conversation. And you know, we've been very lucky to have had so many good friends, and we still have very many good friends who've helped us from day one and continue to help us. But I think what's important for Afghanistan is that the country is a changed place from 2001. And people have been transformed. You know, a lot of people think it was a waste of time and money, $1 trillion, so many lives. And nothing really changed in Afghanistan. But what has changed is the people. So you still have a very young population, median age is 18, something like 80% under the age of 30, a vibrant country, even to this day. I think in Washington Post had a story a few days ago where women continue to be women and they interact with each other. They go to clubs and restaurants and not nightclubs, but, you know, social clubs. They still study, you know, albeit, illegal schools and institutions. So, and in some ways, when you land, and, you know, some of my colleagues are here today, and you go through immigration, as I told Christiane a couple of weeks ago, there are women stamping your passports. You go onto the street, women are still driving, women still go shopping. So the weird thing is that it seems normal, but it's not. And the problem is the Taliban 2.0 is not that different to 1.0. The difference is when it comes to implementation, the people in charge today in Kabul are not enforcing these rules as strictly as they were in the 1990s. Anyway, we didn't take any chances. So while we continued the Afghan business, which is totally ring-fenced, and we got rid of music, got rid of soap operas, what we did was we created platforms outside that provide music, soap operas, and so forth. So the population now has access to both. They have the ring-fenced Afghan business, and they have stuff coming via satellite and via online. And so they get their dose of soap operas and music and entertainment. But what we also did was we created these education programs, which have been, I think it's perhaps one of the most interesting programs that we have ever done. I mean, of all the things we've done over the last 20 years, our education programs today are just an enormous success. And my colleague Alex Tears in the crowd today. And we work closely with NYU amongst others. And the numbers, so kids, and have done 2,000 kids in terms of a baseline and have monitored their progress. And we do mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology for 7th, 8th, and 9th graders in 2 languages. It's an enormous amount of production on television, normal, you know, terrestrial and satellite television. And kids who don't watch television have, for example, score on average about 24 or 25% in, say, mathematics. The kids who watch television scored 55%. And the kids, especially girls, who are tutored via WhatsApp are getting 75%. People say they've never seen results like this before. I sound a bit like Donald Trump, but it's true, right?
You know, I want to get into this a bit longer. Yeah. I mean, a bit further down the road, what's going on now. But I thought it might be good at first to go back to, say, the good old days.
Yeah.
You know, the heady days.
Your good old days or my good old days?
Well, there was
Tom was there in the 1970s. I mean,
I spent 7 years there, and Saad dragged me back for another 12 or 13 to work with him on Talo TV and so forth. But in 2002, right after the Taliban were routed, you and your brother Saad sort of showed up in Afghanistan, having lived in exile in Japan, which was highly interesting. You speak Japanese, and Australia. But you came back to a country that was really, it's been through 25 years of war. The cities were devastated. There was no media. There was no infrastructure. There was no nothing. I mean, it was totally, and the people, the entire population was traumatized. And somehow you decided, after looking around and saying, maybe I should get into the sheepskin business or the almond business, somehow you said, I'm going to start a radio station, which was the first thing you did. And I'm just wondering, maybe you want to recount for us how that came about, your first step into media in a country that had none.
Well, I mean, it's, Afghanistan, and you may want to talk about Afghanistan in the 70s because it's important for people. People assume Afghanistan was at war for centuries, and that wasn't the case. And, you're the man who can...
Well, when I lived there, it had been 50 years of peace. I mean, the poster, the travel poster said, visit Afghanistan, see the world's friendliest people. That's probably the last thing on most people's mind today.
Yeah, so we went back, and 2002. I mean, it's amazing how time has had gone, because in 2002 it had only been like 13 years since the Soviets had left. So the city had been totally destroyed. We had the civil war that 50,000 odd people died in the mid-90s, which then allowed the Taliban to return to power. So we had this moment that we felt, we could go back and see if we can do something. And we went back and we had a look, and we looked at a number of business opportunities. And the idea was to invest and then to go back to Australia. And we had normal lives back in Australia. And Ahmed Rashid, the well-known Pakistani author, had dinner with Andrew Natsios, the head of USAID. And he had mentioned our interest in media and so forth. It was one of the sectors we were interested in. And Andrew said, Natsio said, we'd like to help. And lo and behold, they gave us a small grant of a couple $100,000, and we put up $300,000, and we set up this very small radio station, assuming that we're going to appoint a manager and it'll be on sort of autopilot. And it was so controversial, even during the test phase, that I literally had to return immediately. And then we just started to manage that business, and it sort of grew. And then we set up a TV station and a second TV station. And then we went outside of Afghanistan. We went for Africa and the Middle East and Pakistan and India and so forth. But it really was an accidental business.
But at the beginning, what you did, you really tapped into this great desire among the population for some form of normalcy, for some form of fun, for some sort of expression. I mean, the Taliban had banned virtually everything. And his radio station was like a FM station came in from outer space with jingles and everything. It had Shakira and Afghan musicians, everything be pouring out of taxi windows. And the country just lit up at this. It was like the DJs would make personal appearances, and at 100,000 people showed up. To show you how the yearning for fun and pleasure was there. And then you took that and translated it into television, which is another business you knew absolutely nothing about.
It sounds like your story.
Well, it's a story I share with a lot of people here.
Yeah, Tom's. What was the account you worked on before you went into? You went traveling?
Charmin toilet paper?
That's it, yeah. from toilet paper to trading in Afghanistan to media. Well, I think it helps if you're not a so-called expert, because you look at things very fresh, and you have this willingness to try things. Even now, I mean, people say, well, it was a great startup, but it's a startup that has never stopped being a startup. It's like Groundhog Day. We have to go through all the growing pains and the ups and downs, and we still always have to look at things, like we're about to launch. And it was difficult, but the interesting thing is, and because we've launched businesses, as in Africa and South Asia and the Middle East and so forth, people are very similar in terms of what they want, and it was important for us to empower the kids on the ground, and we gave them a lot of latitude and a lot of authority, and they created something very interesting. I mean, we were there to help and and assist where we could, but we allowed them to take chances. And some of them, like Masood Sanjar and those people on radio and others on television.
You had a really crack creative organization.
I mean, Tom would visit Kabul and would always dedicate hours with the creative people, with the young people. It would go into a meeting, and so you saw for yourself.
It reminded me a lot of the early days at MTV. I mean, it was true, but it had an amazing impact. And I thought it'd be interesting. You had 20 years of free media that was enshrined in the Afghan Constitution. It was a big deal. While there was no media when he showed up, at the end there was probably 80 television stations, 90 television stations. They had his 3 stations, one of which was a 24-hour news station. The 3 of them combined had like a 75 share, so they really dominated the market. And they were broadcasting a lot of attitudinal stuff. I mean, socially purposeful stuff. And I was just wondering, with all that, after 20 years, you changed essentially an entire generation there. I mean, they have more liberal attitudes, they're more tolerant, and I'm wondering what happens to these people. A woman who grew up there was able to go to college or the university, become a lawyer, become a parliamentarian. And now she can't leave her house without a male relative, and she has to have her body totally covered. How do you think those attitude changes that were so important in the evolution of Afghanistan will stand up under years of Taliban rule? That seems to be in place for a while. Will it endure?
Well, just a question of for how long. I think people, Afghans are very strong. I mean, it's very difficult to bully an Afghan, male or female. And there's a story that someone accompanied an Afghan lady to get a passport in the passports office, and the Taliban in charge was not being attentive, and she started screaming at the Taliban guy and he panicked and went and locked himself in his office. So I don't think women will be, especially in the urban centers, will not be that cowed that easily. But every opportunity I get, I apologize to Afghan women because we've let them down collectively, and it's a difficult thing for them. I'm not saying they're going to give up, and it's not going to be that easy to destroy what we all witnessed, I'd say, in 2021, and even to this day. The situation on the ground is always more nuanced. And even with the Taliban, and I keep talking about how they're not a monolithic movement, that there are different points of view, and some are more pragmatic than others. But it's easy to become and feel very helpless. And that's why I think I've been advocating using this opportunity to talk about the book about engaging and not forgetting about Afghanistan. I think it's been, for the poor people in the White House, the experience of withdrawal was so traumatic that they don't want to go anywhere near Afghanistan. But what about the Afghan population? What about the people that you promised so much to? Those gains of the last 20 years, how do you sustain them? How do you give people hope? So that's why I talk about engagement. It's important. And the Biden administration completely washed its hands off Afghanistan, and the hope is that maybe with the new administration that there is going to be a little bit more engagement. I know that Rina and Karen Decker, who's here in the audience, who's the chargé in Doha, and others have tried. But Afghanistan, I was once quoted that if they could expunge the word Afghanistan from the dictionary in Washington, they would do that.
Well, what are some of the alternatives for other countries in the world, none of which have really recognized the Taliban regime, in terms of being able to engage in a way so help can come to, the general population?
Well, I think there are no good options. We just have to find that's like the least bad option. And I think that, you need an empowered, series of diplomats that can engage. And I think some of the people in Kabul, the Taliban, understand that international engagement is important. But I think what's important is that you're not engaging with the Taliban for the sake of the Taliban government. You're engaging for the sake of the people. The numbers are horrific, and half the population, 20-odd million people, don't have food security. A third of households, obviously the elements, they are at risk because, we have this cold winter ahead. 65-70% of the population doesn't have access to clean water. When it comes to malnutrition, I think it's like 3.5 million people, which is just about 10% of the population. These numbers are, this is not some country that the Americans had never engaged in. This is a country that essentially was a project of the West for 20 years, up until 3 years ago. So the population is suffering because the world has washed its hands off Afghanistan. I know people are trying. I know Rina and others are trying, but it's not enough. And there has to be more engagement. And some of you who've been to Kabul, Christiane's been there, and she met Sirajuddin Haqqani and others, and they understand that it's not that black and white in terms of dealing with the government.
It's interesting that the dreaded Haqqani network is now the liberal wing of the Taliban.
Yes.
But, I've got to say, in the time I spent there was never a dull moment, and there was a price to be paid. And Saad's news organization, Talo TV, and they had 24-hour feed. you lost a lot of employees who were killed, and journalists and regular employees. And I remember one night when you had a suicide bomber attack, drive a car into one of your commuter buses and killed like 7 or 8 people. And after that, or before that, the Taliban had said they put out an execution order on everybody who worked for you, but particularly you. So I'm glad to hear you're on better terms with them now. But I mean, talk about that a little bit, because they had a funeral, and as I remember it, Karzai and all the leaders of the country came, and it was televised, and that was really a moment. Your people were broadcasting music and had a shave and a lot of aspirational programming, but the news really hit the Taliban hard. How did that feel?
Well, I mean, it's like losing your children. Some of these kids that worked for us, from the age of 15 or 16, and they worked for us for a decade. We lost, on that particular occasion, we lost 7 employees, and 15 were injured, some very badly, permanently. A bus that was taking the employees back home was hit by a taxi, a suicide bomber. And the whole thing was filmed and was released later, and as you've seen, it was 20th of January of 2016. It was perhaps one of the most painful experiences of my life. And then we lost another 5 employees in different accidents and suicide bombings. Some in the wrong place at the wrong time, and others targeted. It wasn't easy, and it's funny because we look at Afghanistan today, and the very people who killed our employees are the people we go and talk to, and we sit opposite.
I mean, you gave your employees a choice in sort of a town hall. Do we want to stop, or do we want to keep going? And it was like unanimous. No, we're not going to back down. So they kind of doubled down on the news.
Yeah, I mean,
inspiring.
It was the next morning, and I hadn't slept because I flew from Bombay to Dubai, then to Kabul, and then we had a meeting in the morning. I mean, the first thing we did was we visited the hospital and the injured, and then we visited the families and who lost. Sometimes they're only providers, their loved ones. And then we had a meeting in the office, and it was a cold January morning, and 500 people showed up, and we gave them the option. And I meant it. I said, I'm prepared to close what we have, because not one life is worth it. I think it's easy to say when you're not dealing with things that we should continue. We must persist. This is important. But that afternoon, nothing seemed that important compared to these kids' lives. And we gave them the option, and they wanted to keep going. And but then I also said, it's important for us to work for peace. The very people who committed these crimes are the people we need to sit with and work with, because they're also Afghans. There was some resistance to that. But now I sit opposite the people who committed those crimes, but they say, they have their own stories of siblings, of cousins,
yeah.
of hundreds of kids in their families who were droned, who were attacked, who were killed by Afghan special forces, by U.S. special forces. So they also have their pain, and they have their tragedies. And I think it's important for us to recognize that both sides suffered.
And our side spent $2 trillion over 20 years, which is, pretty remarkable. I got to say, and I saw Dexter Filkins outside. I'm going to embarrass him here. He who wrote The Forever War. But he's got a blurb on the back of this book that I think says a lot about relative value of certain investments. Saad Mohseni did more to change Afghanistan than any single person, and more than all the diplomats and soldiers combined. This fine book tells the story of how one man and the company he created brought a united country into the modern age, which is true, and it endures and hopefully will continue to endure. But
that's why you get your friends to write blurbs for you.
no, there's a lot to be said for that.
There's a willingness.
And I was saying they invested $230,000 in you, and spent $2 trillion on the military. And you said something that would give people a sense that maybe there's a better life ahead, something that people would enjoy, something that they would treasure. You know, it seemed to have media investment can have a big payoff, unfortunately not noted enough. The problem was the country collapsed and was sort of hollowed out by the fact that we looked the other way and let corrupt government officials and warlords basically hollow the place out. So when things fell down, I mean, they just collapsed all at once. There was really no there. And once again, the Afghan people who've suffered so much, really took the brunt of this. As Ghani flew off to Uzbekistan or wherever he went, it's just a continual tragedy.
Yeah, but the place is weirdly very hopeful, and even now, despite everything, people are very resilient in that country. They're probably tired of being this resilient, but nonetheless, there is, you look at the world, and you have to give people hope, and even if you look at the Middle East and so forth, there is this tendency to believe that we can destroy a particular group, and we always caution. We had a lot of debates with the military folks and others that it's impossible to kill an idea. Yeah, you kill a commander, there's another one that pops up. You kill a platoon, Taliban Special Forces platoon, 2 of them pop up. For every person you kill, 3 of them will show up. You have to come up with better ideas. You have to give people hope. And that's the only way. Even with the current guys in Kabul, and it's interesting how they're becoming city dwellers. They go to restaurants with their families, and they know how to go to picnics, and they're becoming. So the question is, who's going to change who? Are we changing them more than they're changing us? And I think if it's left organically, I'm more hopeful they're going to change. But the question is, what's the leadership going to do? And that's why engagement's important. If you look at so many, whether it was Iran in 1980 or Yemen in 2012 and Afghanistan today, there's usually a path that you can engage with some individuals within that movement or that country. The concern I have is that it sort of becomes a North Korea type country, and it becomes very difficult to express yourself or to show yourself or to go out and about. I'll give you one story. When this decree came about women not being able to raise their voices, show their faces and so forth, the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, which put out this decree, called out people and he said, don't you dare take women off air. We want you to continue. It's important for the media to continue. And even now today, people say, have women been silenced and have they disappeared from the public domain? And we say, well, as long as they appear on television, they're going to be okay. We are that canary in the coal mine for now.
That's sort of the Taliban deep state resisting commands from above.
That's right.
Well, I want to open this up for
just before I forget, I want to thank some people. Binky, thank you so much for all your help. Wonderful friend. Ken came to Kabul in 2012, I think, and that's when we first met. I want to thank Jenna Krajewski, who basically wrote the book, and Samin Gauhar, who fact-checked things, and she obviously picked up a lot of stuff. And thankfully, we fixed them. The team at Leslie Cohen and team at HarperCollins, I want to thank. Very generous, very helpful. And I think that's it. Robert Thompson, who helped put the deal together. I'm not sure if he's here tonight, but I think his name was on the list. But so many friends. Thank you all for coming. And but anyway, questions.
We have more questions.
Okay, yeah, sure.
A very gracious man, and you're in the presence of one of the world's greatest optimists, as you can tell. Who else would do this? But I think some people are wondering, well, boy, the Taliban, they banned television, they banned media. Why are you still on the air? Just tell us for a minute, for you to stay on the air now, what did you have to do to adjust your programming, to meet the Taliban standards? What did you have to take off?
Well,
I know they wanted you to play television of just scenery.
Yeah.
That was one of their ideas, a Babbling Brook kind of thing.
Well, we got rid of music. We got rid of soap operas. They want to the weird thing is they want women segregated. So if you have a show like a town hall meeting of 300 women discussing an issue, that's okay. But if there's a man and a woman on stage, that's not okay. So we have to adjust. We have adjusted to those sorts of demands. But we have our red lines. I mean, we're getting close to them now, and. But it was important for us to remain in Kabul, in Afghanistan. We have a lot of bureaus, a lot of stringers and journalists, is not just to inform the Afghans and to entertain them and to educate them, but also to get news out of Afghanistan. Because, in the old days, in the good old days, and Dexter Filkins and so many others were in Kabul, today there are only a handful of journalists because international media is not that interested. But our presence on the ground then allows for news to get out of Afghanistan. So we play both roles.
Well, it's great you're still there anyway. Anyone have a question for Saad? Tina?
How much impact did your TV stations have on rural Afghanistan? I mean, was this an urban phenomenon in its popularity, or was it actually watched, in very rural parts?
No, it was a national phenomena to watch television, soap operas and so forth. And in rural areas, they had less entertainment, so it was even more important for them to have access to television. Now, in the areas where the Taliban were strong and they had banned television, I mean, people were afraid to watch it because of satellite dishes and so forth. But I think it's a bit like the U.S. in the 1950s. Single TV households. People gather around the television set, they watch it. Or a street would have, or a small community would have a TV set. So people are very engaged, media-wise.
So it had a cultural impact on them too.
Yes.
In the back.
Saad, you talked about the importance of engagement, and you said it's important to take the least bad option. So 2 questions. One is, have you heard anything recently in Western capitals to suggest that there's an openness to do that kind of engagement? And B, we don't have a good history of choosing the least bad option. We always seem to choose the worst bad option. How should we go about choosing the least bad? What is the least bad?
Well, I think you start choosing one bad option, and then you go on to the next bad option, and then you go back. No, I think, listen, in America, the American intelligence officials, from what I hear, are deeply engaged because of CT and ISIS and so forth. The Germans are engaged because they want to get rid of all the criminal Afghans and others who were there as Afghans, and they just kicked out 27 of them. Others are engaged because of drugs. Obviously, the Pakistanis and the Iranians don't want hundreds of thousands of refugees. A lot of Europeans don't want a lot of. So you don't engage just because you like the Afghans. You also engage because there's a need for your own national security interests to engage. But I think this is no easy task. I think you keep trying different things and different ways to engage. And you can take baby steps before. There's a lot of stuff that's being discussed now, and some of the diplomats in the audience can probably whisper to you. But there is a path of sorts. Jamie.
So it is true that the Taliban crackdown on kids is probably. You say the new administration doesn't have all the standings for withdrawal. What I would say that would be realistic is the money back. The assets that demands would have us make to get those assets. It's a good idea to engage with them. And hopefully they won't always get the words out, but there are times when things can go worse. So what would be the first try?
Well, with the central bank assets, for those of you who don't know, Afghanistan is $6 or $7 billion in the U.S. And those assets are frozen immediately. And by the way, none of the sanctions are new. The sanctions from the 1990s and early 2000s imposed on the Taliban, and they were sort of grandfathered in. and those assets were frozen. And then the Biden administration, I think it was quite clever. Then all of a sudden, the families, the 9/11 victims' families, I don't know when it was, they sued the Taliban, and everyone laughed, and it seemed at that time a waste of time and money. But when the Taliban came back to power, they had a case because the Taliban were found guilty or complicit in 9/11. So all of a sudden, these funds were exposed. So the American administration, and I think it was quite smart, they took half the money, shifted it to Switzerland, ring-fenced those assets, but then no one else could touch it. It's managed by an independent group of people. It has 4, let's call them governors. So the Taliban want those assets, and of course the international community is saying no. One thing we've suggested, and I've written about this, is to let the Taliban have observer status with the money management team. You can also train them up, because managing a central bank affects the whole country, the way they manage the currency in terms of inflation and so forth. So those are baby steps that they don't have access to the money, they don't manage the money, but they are observing and they're learning. And you shift the whole thing to Qatar or Turkey or somewhere, and that's one step that would build goodwill between the different sides. But at the same time, you're signaling that there is a path, that the next step could be something more, and eventually they could gain access to those funds.
Hey, one more question, Ken. Hold it up.
Saad, why are you not surprised that they haven't closed down Polo TV?
Well, because, so you have a leader that no one's seen. We've only heard his voice. He lives in Kandahar. We assume he's about 55 or 60. He's quite young. He's the leader of the faithful. So they've chosen him, and he has absolute authority. No one can challenge him. And they've pledged allegiance to this man. And media silence or media going off only benefits one man, him. He doesn't need the media. He's a dictator. But for every other Taliban member, it's important for them to be able to amplify their messages. As a matter of fact, they've embraced the media. Press conferences, they have spokespeople, they have WhatsApp groups. They're quite sophisticated in the way that they manage the media. Even in the days when they were in opposition, they were quite sophisticated. So for the more pragmatic types, they understand the importance of media. If media is silenced, so are they. So I think it's important for them to have free media.
So the dictator has limited power?
No, the dictator has absolute power.
No, but why doesn't he get his way and close Polo TV?
It may come to that. And I think one of the reasons that these new restrictions, it's because he probably feels that, but you have to remember that he was a spiritual individual. The guys who fought and essentially prevailed are the guys sitting in Kabul. They're the pragmatic ones. He's becoming stronger by the day, and eventually he may do that.
Now, it's true, he's only been to one city, Kabul, for one afternoon in his life, right? He's never left the country.
I think he's been twice. He's been to Kabul twice.
That's it.
That's it.
For city life.
Yeah.
So how come he's still getting stronger? What great thing is happening that's increasing his popularity?
Because he has been left unchallenged. And I've mentioned this to the Taliban. Look at Iran. Khamenei, when he assumed power, he was known as a sort of a dandy cleric, not quite qualified. He used to drive a Volkswagen Beetle, and people didn't take him that seriously. But time and power, absolute power, made him much stronger. And I'm afraid something similar is happening in Afghanistan. So for the pragmatists, for them to prevail, they have to do something soon. And that's why I'm saying engage now, before it's too late.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Saad.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.